Okay. Well, Dr. Stephen Miller, welcome to our Zoom call again. I know we've had you on before. It's great to be with you again. I know you're coming from where you teach down there at Kennesaw State. From what I understand, you're teaching some classes there. He's a professor of philosophy there. Dr. Miller, welcome, and we thank you for coming back to talk about your new book. Why don't you tell us, just quickly, or take as much time as you want. I'm sorry. What was it that got you going in this direction after your last book? Why did you go in this direction with the newest book?
So my earlier two books on near-death and deathbed experiences were mainly geared toward atheists and naturalists, or people who are doubting the afterlife and God and need help. I've had struggles at various times in my life with doubt, and so apologetics has meant a tremendous amount to me. And I wanted people to are questioning those basic things to see that I think there's wonderful evidence here that there's an afterlife and a God, and several things that it supports about Christianity as well. So those are my earlier two books, but Christians have just not latched onto this thing yet. It seems to be in general, theologians. Now, there are exceptions like Gary Habermas or J.P. Moreland, who've talked about it in relation to miracles and to defending the resurrection and saying there is a division between the soul and the brain, and the dualism and the miracles to support those things. But in general, there's been a lot of just hesitancy to even get into this. And so I think Christians feel like when they have such experiences that they don't have anybody to talk to about them, or a pastor or a Christian friend may shut them down because they don't know what to say. And it just, for one reason or another, and then some strong Christians that are very popular have written things against it. Like John MacArthur has a couple of chapters on near-death experiences in his book on heaven. The Bible Answer Man, he wrote some things similar as well. Now, in all honesty, I kind of agree with their critiques, because what they did was to read a lot of popular books where people were claiming to have had these experiences, and they're saying there's a lot of questionable theology here. And I agree. I just don't think that's the way you study near-death experiences, or writing people's books who may be out there for profit, or, we don't even know the people. I think we need to get into the main studies by reputable researchers and see what they're finding about near-death experiences. When I looked at those near-death experiences, the core experiences that people were reporting to legitimate researchers, they looked to me like they were very consistent with historic Christian doctrine. So I thought I really need to get in and answer the questions, legitimate questions that Christians have about this, and try to give more of a systematic theology of near-death and deathbed experiences, so that I could set up groundwork for these experiences. Let's call it afterlife apologetics, to where this would be a legitimate area of apologetics that is being taught in seminaries and Bible colleges, and that Christians are reading up on, and particularly using it in their conversations with their friends, because these are so widespread. We're just finding them everywhere if you start talking to people about it, and people that you would never even think would be open to spiritual things. This is a big part of their experience. So I think we as Christians need to be able to help them to see how that fits into Christian theology, and lead them a little further in their search.
You find that many people in general, since I don't know how much dialogue you've able to use these books with people that don't believe, they're not Christians, but you just find people in general out there in the public are pretty mortified of dying, and they're terrified of what's going to happen. I mean, do you find that kind of general consensus in a lot of people, or it's a mixed bag? I mean, I think COVID kind of exposed that a bit, obviously. But
Sure.
I mean, what do you find out there when you maybe talked about this with unbelievers or something? I know you have your class.
I've not really done a survey on that, so I just have to say I'm not sure how morbid people tend to be about death. I mean, it does seem like a lot of people just want to completely avoid the subject on the one hand. On the other hand, they seem very fascinated about the morbid, especially around Halloween, and
Right.
they and people are fascinated with it. And so there's probably a little bit of each going on there, but it's certainly relevant because, last time I checked, the death rate in the United States was 100%. Every one of us are going to die,
And pay
and
taxes.
people think about it. People think about it, and so this is a topic that they want to think about.
Yeah. Do you you talked about some of the criticisms by Hank Hanegraaff, John MacArthur, and everything. So are they looking at some of these books like Heaven is Real and some of these other books that turned out to be kind of not legitimate, that they're just kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Is that what you kind of notice with them?
I think so. Now, Heaven is for Real. It was not shown to be illegitimate. It was another one by the Malarkeys that was, they confessed up and said it never really happened. And I think that, yes, we need to be concerned about those books, but it looked to me like they didn't refer to any of the major studies of near-death experiences. They were just warning us about, hey, get your theology from the Bible, not for people you don't even know who are claiming to have had these experiences. And wow, that's biblical. I agree with that. But you're right. What they do is say, therefore, near-death experiences are either hallucinations or they're of the devil. So let's just not even go there. Just stick
Right.
with the Bible. And I'm saying, hey, I'm all about sticking with the Bible, but whenever you have experiences that are confirming what we see in the Bible, let's give them a look.
Right. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about your parts of the book where you talk about these near-death experiences and other people's lives that are not believers. They're not followers of Jesus. You have some chapters on Hinduism, Islam, and what what do we do with that? I mean, there's people having near-death experiences all across the board, all across the world, different cultures, and some of them have similar themes. So is it your thought that some of these experiences they're having, even though Jesus doesn't seem to really appear in these near-death experiences, maybe he's manifesting himself in the form they can understand in their religion? Is there something that's compatible with Christianity, or do we just as Christians say, no, those near-death experiences can't be from God because they really don't point people to Jesus, and these people aren't coming to faith in Jesus through these experiences from a Hindu or Islamic background? So why don't you go ahead and talk a little about that?
From my reading of the Bible, Old Testament and New, with the Jews, he was saying, okay, I'm not just doing this salvation thing just for the Jews and to hell with everybody else. God was saying, I'm setting you up as to be a light to the world. And I think God's heart has always been old and new for the world. God so loved the world. And so we see, according to Romans 1, that he's given us the creation to the whole world, where people could look at the creation and say, oh my goodness, this is really complicated. How could something like this have ever come along naturalistically? And I think the person who's searching for God, wherever they are, Irian Jaya or India or wherever they are, they can look at those things and get started on their search. And that's just kind of a general revelation that uh, many people are aware of. Now, the beginning of the world, the beginning of the universe, that doesn't say anything right off about Jesus. The settings of the universe, when we talk about those, the precise settings, they don't say anything about Jesus, but we don't say, well, wait a minute, if these aren't talking about Jesus, they're just no good at all. So people like Gary Habermas would say, look, here's an experience that we can at least say is showing us that people can separate from their bodies, which is very consistent with dualism, that the material world is not all there is. The material body is not all that we are. And this is an experience that gives good evidence of this. As I said in my first book, Dr. Sabom, when he studied these, he he didn't believe in them when he started. He was a cardiologist teaching at Emory University School of Medicine, very well respected. Somebody had talked to him about near-death experiences. He said, I just don't believe it. He said, none of my patients have reported this. And the nurse he was talking to said, well, go talk to your patients and see what they have to say. And they began to report these experiences. And he said, why didn't you ever tell me about this? And they'd say, well, you're the last person I would tell. You'd probably send me to the psych ward or something if I was your patient. So the doctor's often the last person they would tell. They might tell a nurse or somebody in their close family. But when they began to study them, they said, just like Habermas found, there's evidence that they are actually outside their bodies. It's an evidential thing. And that's what Sabom found after interviewing them for about a year. He said, the evidence that they're actually seeing their bodies is, I know something about resuscitations, and they're all different in different contexts. And he said the people who had cardiac arrest, experienced clinical death, these could accurately describe what was going on while they were basically brain dead. How did they know that? But he said to test this theory, somebody might say, well, they've watched TV before and medical shows. They know how it's done. So they're probably just drawing from their own memories. And so he said, okay, well, I've got a good test of that. I'll talk to my patients who experienced clinical death, but did not experience a near-death experience. That's probably like 70%, 65 or 70% of them don't have any experience. And I'll ask them what they think happened in their resuscitation. Well, they all got it wrong in many details. They were just guessing. So about a year into a study, he said, these people are coming out of their bodies. Well, what do they report when they come out? They report seeing a being of light who almost all of them identify as God. They have a life review. They're in a place that's, I would call it a vestibule to heaven. It's not our final new heavens and new earth, but they're somewhere in a spiritual world. And they may see angels, deceased relatives. Well, this is significant stuff, even if it doesn't talk about Jesus. And as a core experience, we see these things across cultures where we shouldn't, if it's just a naturalistic thing that was based upon people's expectations of death. So I think it's really significant. Now you say, well, what about people in other cultures that experience their own gods and their own theology? That's one thing in this book I went in to study. The way I approached it, I felt like the most objective way to see what people in various cultures were experiencing is I went into the NDERF site, NDERF. Dr. Long and his wife have been collecting near-death experiences for years in this online database. It's free. Anybody can look at it. Some of them really aren't even near-death experiences, but he just lets everybody put everything on there without him sifting through. That way his own worldview doesn't get put forward. But you can look at, and what I did is I took about 140 near-death experiences, consecutive ones, starting with number 1. And I said, okay, how many of these contain anti-Christian theology? How many of them are pushing other gods? How many are pushing, in their experience, saying that they experienced some type of reincarnation or any kind of new age teachings? And what I found was it was extremely small, maybe 1 or 2%, which you're expecting to have all kinds of things in a database like this. But many people were telling me, oh, near-death experiences teach reincarnation, or they teach that all religions are equal. And I really just didn't find this in significant numbers. So I think the people that are promoting these other doctrines are grabbing niche experiences, anomalous experiences, and sharing them as if they're the core, which makes it look like Mormon theology is true, or New Age theology is true, or whatever their niche theology is, which of course you can do with anything. You've got to take the core experience and realize that some people have mental illness, some people were on drugs when it happened. For some people, they're lying in order to sell a book about their experience. So we have to throw out the anomalous ones. But when we look at the core experience, I think it's very consistent with historic Christianity.
Okay, so if a Muslim or a Hindu has this experience, or someone who isn't a Christian going in, and they have this experience, which you talk about in your book, someone maybe skeptical, someone just living a life apart from God, whatever, and they have this experience, but let's say the near-death experience doesn't really they come out of it. It's like, yeah, it changed their life. Maybe there's some life, it really is something they're going to remember the rest of their life, but doesn't really point them to the gospel. There's no Jesus in the near-death experience. There's no presentation of the gospel. Then could someone just say, well, I don't really, what's so significant about this? I mean, is it just to get them out of their materialistic worldview of material world is all there is to get? Is it like a step to get them going that direction, or three, we just don't know what God's doing with it? I mean, what would you say someone would object to it? Like, what's the significance if it doesn't get them to faith in Jesus? It confirms their Buddhism, Islam, their Hinduism, or their Muslim faith, or their atheism, whatever.
Well, it doesn't necessarily confirm their faiths.
Okay.
I mean, think of someone who goes into it. Now, people like Hindus and Buddhists, there are all stripes of those. So we don't want to ever put them in a box.
Right.
But let's say that you're a person who believes that there's really an impersonal God up there who doesn't really know that much about our personal lives or get involved. He's an impersonal God. And in the end, we're all going to meld with some kind of universal mind. But it's not something personal, right? And we, for some, they would say that we don't really even exist as an individual, that's all an illusion. And again, we're looking for this nirvana to be enlightened. But okay, so they have a near-death experience. Well, what they experience is they are very much still an individual on the other side, communicating with deceased relatives. They are communicating with a God who is very, very personal and knows them and cares about them. Well, a lot of these things really don't fit very well with certain theologies of certain groups, even within Christianity or in cults near Christianity that teach that we're really having at our death, we experience soul sleep until the final resurrection. Well, it doesn't seem to fit good with that type of theology because you're you're on the other side, you're outside of your body. Some Christians just swear that we are only a soul and a body that's together. When we die until the final resurrection. And yet in this experience, now I think the Bible teaches otherwise. I think the Bible teaches clearly that there's a soul that can separate from the body, like 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul had his experience, and he says, whether I was in the body or not in the body, I don't know. But apparently he believed it was theologically okay to think that you could go somewhere outside of your body, right? And Jesus saying to the thief on the cross, today you will be with me in paradise. Well, the thief was going to be in the grave. There's obviously, to me, a soul and a spirit, and also the transfiguration. They're visiting with Moses and Elijah, who've been long dead. Moses has been buried, his body's gone, but hey, they're talking to Moses. So I think for religions that don't believe in a personal God, that don't believe that you go to the other side afterwards, maybe they believe you're immediately reincarnated. What are they doing visiting with relatives that have been dead for years and years on the other side? Why are they not reincarnated as animals or totally different people here? Why are they communicating? These things should cause questions to come up in people's minds when we see such a core experience across the world. And by the way, one of my surprise findings was that Jesus is very common in near-death experiences. Maybe 17 to 20% of the ones, they were saying they saw Jesus. And even if it were just Christians seeing Jesus, well, that may make sense because people see on the other side people that they already know, right? Deceased relatives that they knew. Maybe those that already know Jesus are more likely to see him on the other side. There are people from other religions who have seen Jesus on the other side in their near-death experience, but I don't know the incidents. I don't know how many of them. But to me, just like with the beginning of the universe, the precise settings of the universe, so many of these things, they don't say anything about Jesus, but that doesn't mean Jesus doesn't exist. For me, there may be thousands of reasons God lets certain people see these things and others not. But one of them, I suspect, is that he wants to start us searching. And he knows that if we seek, we'll find. He wants us to look at the universe and say, this thing is just too complex to have just happened. And even though they don't know anything about Jesus at this point, it causes them to search beyond themselves. If you look at visions in the Bible, like the Apostle Paul's vision, he didn't immediately get the gospel in the vision.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that in the New Testament, God has given the sharing of the gospel to humans to carry out. And I don't see places where he's giving the gospel out in visions or things like this. I suspect this is just like other biblical visions, and that it gives us a part of what we need, instigates our searching, and we see throughout the Bible, you will seek and find when you search for me with all your heart. Seek and ye shall find. Present tense in the Greek Testament. Seek and keep on seeking and you'll find. I believe seeking is very important to God, and he's a rewarder of those who seek him. In Paul in Acts, I believe it's 17, where he's there on Mars Hill. He says he created these people who spread out among the whole earth, so that they may seek him. So I believe God values our seeking, and this is something that gets us started that direction. And a part of the seeking that results is because they realize if they've been living for just material things, living for self, all of a sudden they realize the things they thought were so important are no longer important. It's really love. And they've fallen far short of doing that in their lives. And I think that's a thing that causes them to value spiritual things and begin seeking. And Sabom found most of the patients he interviewed in his second study, called the Atlanta study, because some people were saying that everybody was just going into New Age stuff and whatever that. And he said, well, let's test it. Let's go in. And the patients he talked to got more involved with personal Bible study. If they were just a casual attender, they became a fervent attender of church. More conservative churches that actually taught the Bible, they would pray, read their Bibles, go to church. And we find that with a large number, maybe most, Now, somebody just coming out of a near-death experience, if all they know is New Age friends, or they go find a group who are into New Age that are studying near-death experiences, they may toy with that for a time. But I believe if they continue to seek, God will give them enough information to find.
Okay. So in your book, you actually go over some of the Bible objections, some biblical texts supposedly against near-death experiences. You talk about some of these texts. Let me mention one of them, Hebrews 9:27-28, which says, "And it is appointed for men to die once, and after this the judgment. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many." So what we're saying in near-death experiences are that people are dying more than once. Apparently, it's a contradiction to this verse. First, they have their near-death experience, they have that, and then they have the final death where they die. So I know you've responded to that in the book, but I mean, how do you respond to that text again? I mean, I know there's some other texts you mentioned, but do you remember off the top of your head how you respond to that one?
Sure. I think at first glance that seems to contradict. It just obviously, he says, you only die once. But as in English, Greek also has, each word can have various meanings, depending on the context. Context is king in interpretation. And in that context, it's very obvious he's talking about our final death. Now you say, oh, okay, well, you're just kind of being wishy-washy here with scripture. But if you think about it, Jesus rose several people from the dead, okay? And so when he rose Lazarus from the dead, if you look at that context, one time he uses the word death to mean temporary death. He said, okay, Lazarus is dead. At another point, he says, don't worry about it. He's not dead, or somebody, he would say, they're not dead, they're sleeping, and everybody kind of laugh at him. But so in those contexts, sometimes he would speak of death as a temporary death. Okay, yeah, the person's not breathing, their heart's not beating, they're dead, but they're not experiencing their final death. Of course, Jesus rose them from the dead, so now they've died twice, right? So if you're taking the Hebrews passage to mean you can only die once, the Bible itself contradicts that. In fact, all these people being resuscitated by cardiologists, that contradicts that as well, because they're clinically dead, temporarily dead, but they come back. So I think we've got to look more carefully at what the Bible's saying and what it says will happen at final death, and distinguish that from what's really kind of a halftime experience, not with a final heaven, but with what I'm just calling the other side, maybe the vestibule of heaven. I mean, where is it that all these angels are hanging out now and demons? Well, there's another side, a spiritual side of life. They're going over there. They see part of it, but they're not in a final heaven. And we see the word heaven used in several ways as well. I mean, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, he uses the term paradise, but he also mentions heaven. So these words can be fluid, so I don't get real technical with people when they say, oh, I've been to heaven. Okay, well, you've been to the other side and it was delightful and that's cool. I'll call it the other side. You can call it heaven, and that's fine. But I think you've hit upon the main problem that Christians have, that I've talked to with near-death experiences. What Christians are expecting at death is what they're expecting at final death. They're going to come before God. There's going to be some kind of a judgment. There's going to be all these things that we hear about, the streets of gold and all these things. Most of these things are happening after the final judgment, when you have a new heavens and new earth, but they're all happening at the end, after your final death. What we're talking about is a temporary death. It's more like a vision where God gives people the opportunity to see things that are going on the other side in the spiritual world and brings them back. So those that are saying, no, that contradicts what the Christians are expecting. Yeah, it contradicts what we're expecting, because we're expecting a final death. But it's not in contradiction to visions in general, and I'm not seeing anything that contradicts historic Christian theology here.
But it seems like these near-death experiences, when you take like the hellish ones, people have the hellish encounters and the heaven encounters. Seems like there's not really, you can't say that the people are having the hellish, we would think the hellish ones they're having, the bad ones, are only for the people who've rejected God in this life or living wicked lives. So he uses the hellish one to wake them up. But it seems like in your research that even people that are like that, not living for God, living a life of disobedience, that they can have the good ones, the good
Sure.
experiences, right? So it's not really, we can't just say, well, the hellish ones you talk about in your book are for the bad people, and the heavenly ones are for the good people, or the ones that are strong Christians or something. It seems like it's all across the board. I mean, like you can't really box them in each one, right? Am I correct?
I think you're correct in that. I think that people that have the experience come out of it with a motivation to seek more. Maybe they were a Christian, but not really that committed to God. And when they got to the other side, Jesus or an angel or somebody showed them a glimpse of hell, not throwing them in hell typically, but they just saw demonic creatures, or they saw people suffering on the other side. And then maybe Jesus saved them out of that and said, that's not what I want for you. I love you. I think he knows who needs to see hell, who needs to see a bit of heaven, and he gives to the person the experience that they need. So yes, I think some of the people who see some hellish things may be believers, typically who need a wake-up call to their lives, and that's the way they take it. And but as far as the goodness of God, think about it. I don't know why Christians think that in a halftime experience, anybody who's not a Christian, he ought to show hell. There's nothing in the Bible that says if a non-Christian has a vision, they ought to see hell. And yet that just is so intuitively obvious that many people have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think of Jesus, when he was on earth, he talked to the woman at the well. He didn't seem to be yelling at her. He seemed to show her love, and Jesus was known as a friend of sinners. He was treating these people nicely, that were apparently headed for hell, but he treated them nicely. Why would he be so nice to people who are sinners? Well, God loves sinners. For God so loved the world. He loves all of them. God, as a part of his nature, is incredibly loving. And when Jesus taught us about how we ought to treat even our enemies, he said, for for God, is good to the rebellious, to the bad people, to the disobedient. So if you look at Romans 2, Paul says the kindness of God leads us to repentance. I believe God's end game is to give everybody a chance to understand him as a God who loves them deeply, wants them to come to him. And that's the reason he wants us to choose him, because we love him and we realize he actually loves us. So I see it very appropriate that he would show someone who's living a life that's headed for hell, to show them his love. And so that the love, that his kindness actually leads them to repentance. Right? I mean, if he took, let's say that he took Hitler, and right before Hitler died, he gave him a deathbed experience where he saw hell and said, choose, what do you want? I mean, if I were Hitler, I'd go, man, I want heaven. I don't want hell. That's awful down there. But does that really achieve God's end plan? I think he's showing his love to people rather than trying to scare them into some decision.
Okay. What about some of these people come out of near-death experiences are confident in their salvation. Maybe they didn't. I mean, they think they're going to heaven. That's what I mean, that aspect of salvation. So could an objection be that the near-death experiences could be the lives, since the enemy is the father of lies, is it possible he could deceive them into believing that they're actually going to heaven now and really they're not? It's like a deception of some kind to give them that confidence, even if they're not truly saved. Like they come out of the near-death experience going, okay, there's some sort of God. I'm good now. I'm going to heaven when I die. But they really haven't done anything to the person to Jesus yet. So could Satan use that as like a deception in some way?
Yes, and I believe that seeking is a long-term thing, and many people, when they come out of an experience, will say things like, "Oh, God's not like anything like my church told me he was. He's not judgmental at all. He didn't judge me at all. I judged myself when I saw the frailties of my life, and so God just loves everybody, and death's nothing to worry about." But at that point, they've never studied hellish experiences that people have. They just have one experience and they may come to all kinds of wrong conclusions when they first get out of it. But secondly, so distinguish between what a person says their outcome of the experience is with what they actually say happened in the experience. Let's say you had a person who went to a very judgmental church and hellfire and brimstone's all they ever heard. Well, they go see a very loving God and they're saying, oh, well, this is different than what the church taught me. The church is wrong. Well, they have a very limited church experience and experience with Christians, and they're basing it off that. But in direct answer to your questions, yes, I believe that there is a father of lies, a personal evil on the other side, and his demons. And I believe they are imitators of good things. We see that through the Bible. I mean, back in Pharaoh's time and Moses, the magicians were imitating the miracles of Moses. Uh, Visions. We're not supposed to believe a vision, even if an angel comes to us, Paul says, with a gospel other than what he gave them, let them be anathema. Okay, so there are real angels, but there are also apparently imitation angels that are posing as angels. I think they're demons who pose as deceased relatives that people think they're getting advice from. So McQuilkin at Columbia International University, he's one of my favorite interpreters of scripture, but he used to say that it's easier to go to a consistent extreme than to stay in the center of biblical tension.
Hmm.
I believe in this case, what we're seeing is that some people want an all or nothing.
Mhm.
Okay, are near-death experiences, are they from God, or are they from the devil, or are they hallucinations? What are they? And I'd say, well, there's probably some of each. But I think what we're supposed to do, just like we would do with somebody claiming to have a prophetic word or somebody claiming to have seen a miracle, we don't naively accept them all. We don't naively reject them all. We test each thing that we see and say, is this of God or not? And I think they're basic biblical principles for that. You know, is what they're saying consistent with what God has told us in the past through the scriptures? If not, that doesn't sound like a God thing. You know, is it bearing good fruit? Jesus said, if it bears good fruit, you know, that hey, maybe this is a God thing. What would Satan's strategy be? And you know, I can imagine Wormwood and Beelzebub, you know, getting together, and one tells the other, "Hey, I've got a great idea. Let's give people an experience when they come near death, to where they go up and see a loving God, and they get a life review and find out they ought to be all about love, and they're motivated to seek Him." And Beelzebub says, "What?" You know, it just doesn't sound like a great strategy for him to be involved with, unless it's to try to assure certain people that they're doing fine when they're really not. And I think we have to point those out. You know, First Thessalonians 5, Paul says this. He says, let's see, do not despise prophetic utterances, do not quench the spirit. I think many times we're in danger of quenching the spirit when we just throw out all visions and all healings and all these things. When what if God is really working? You know, that's a serious thing. But he says, examine everything carefully. So people that are going onto YouTube looking for near-death experiences and deathbed experiences and just kind of naively accepting everything they see as gospel truth, they're not examining everything carefully and holding to only what is good. So, yes, I think there are elements of all those things. We need to be careful in judging them.
Can you quickly tell me in these near-death experiences, I know there's common themes in all of them, like there's certain, I read, anyway, what are the common themes in each one? And there seems to be some commonality on each one of them. What are they across the board, all cultures? Can you
So,
maybe
near-death
go through
experience,
those?
somebody in India, the United States,
Yeah,
Japan, they've been studied. I mean, there's been
yes,
a ton of study that's gone on by
right,
legitimate researchers, and most of the people I talked to have never even entered the studies before. And that's why I wrote my first book,
right.
introduce you to the studies that have been indeed global. But let's say a person has a cardiac arrest, and then they see them, they find themselves outside of their body looking down at some weird body down there that's relatively lifeless, and then they realize, oh my goodness, this is my body. I'm fully conscious outside of my body. Then they may see a tunnel up in the corner of the room, and if they go through it, and by the way, when they describe these things, they often don't say it was a tunnel. They'll say, the best way I can describe it is it was like a tunnel. Okay, so ineffability is one of the characteristics of it. As crazy as my general dreams are, they are effable. I can tell you what happened in my dreams,
Mm,
but they get on the other side and they're seeing colors that they've never seen before. They've got understanding of things they've never understood before. They will talk to people mind to mind on the other side rather than having to speak. Um, that time and space seem to be different on the other side. Why would there be a commonality across cultures of these things if nobody's really expecting that from the start? So they may go through the tunnel, come the other side, visit with some angelic beings, some deceased relatives. Sometimes they'll see a deceased relative that they didn't even know existed. You know, maybe a stillborn child that was their brother that they didn't know about. They're all kind of things they see on the other side that correspond to what's going on earth. They may say that they went through that God took them through their entire life, and they were able to see the impact of what they had done and said on other people, maybe several times removed, and the impact of what they had done, both good and bad. Then they may have a conversation, or they see great beauty often. I'm talking about the good ones here. And then they may talk to an angel or to Jesus or to God about, is it their time to come back? And I've never seen one where somebody said, you know, we discussed it and decided it was a better idea for me to go on to heaven. And then they found themselves back in every case that I've seen with the decision to return, they make the decision, either they make the decision to return or they want to stay, and God says, no, it's not your time yet. Then they send them back and they find themselves back in their body. And
Hmm.
it's life changing. There's not a good reason for most of these, if they're not writing a book about their own experience, there's not a real good reason for them to lie about it, because they're very hesitant to even talk about it in the first place. So I think when you have a cardiologist that's interviewing them, there's not a lot of good reasons for them to be lying to him about it. And so why is there this consistency across culture of these core things that happen? And by the way, when I found the 17 to 20% of them on the NDERF site, which are sent in from all kinds of cultures, that's actually a higher percentage of the people that maybe report tunnels or report other things that we consider part of the core experience. It's not like everybody experiences all of these elements. There's just core elements that are 17 to 20 to 40% that people globally are experiencing.
And what's the just a couple more? What's the most common objection by skeptics to this about some sort of chemical it's released in your brain or something? Explain it away. What do they call that? You see, you understand, Dr. Mo's in scientific research. It isn't like just a theological thing he's teaching tonight.
True.
It's based on scientific data that he has compiled. So I want everyone to make sure they understand that. Go ahead. I'm sorry. What was
And this has been studied long enough to where there's just been scores and scores of studies by very reputable researchers. It's really kind of like the secular world is giving us this research, and we as Christians are looking at it and saying, is that consistent with Christianity? So
Mhm.
it's not coming out of our seminaries. It's not pastors that got together and said, let's study this thing. These are just very competent researchers that have gone into it. But when they're talking about um, in okay, so repeat your question one more
What's the
time. My
most?
mind just went.
That's okay. I that's my fault because I went off on another tangent. But what's the most common objection
Common
the
objections. Okay.
skeptic gives this?
You know,
That comes
the
from a
amazing thing to me, yeah, there's uh, one article on showing that it was claiming that near-death experiences have now been shown to be purely naturalistic or whatever. And I have appendices responding to some of these in my first book on near-death experiences. But typically, what they've done is they've not really looked thoroughly at the research, because Moody, who wrote the original book that exposed the world to near-death experiences, 1975 and 1976 is when that came out. He already talked about anoxia, hypoxia, talked about, you know, okay, could it be explained by drugs or the brain emitting certain substances that are similar to DMT or LSD with the dying brain? He had already brought up most of these and through and dismissed them for one reason or another. But since then, uh, researchers have looked into these, and they've looked into the doctor's records to see what was going on. They've compared DMT experiences to near-death experiences and found, for example, yes, the DMT people may see sentient beings on the other side, but they're much more likely to see clowns or aliens or insects talking to them than very few would say they saw deceased relatives on the other side, for example. So they've compared these, they've done studies. And if you look at the summary studies, if you don't want to get into all the studies, look at some of the best summary studies, and they'll show you that researchers have carefully looked into these naturalistic objections and rejected them for very good reasons. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons is most obvious to me of all is that with deathbed experiences, there's really a cluster of experiences that happen around death. Some of these are happening to people who are not dying, who are having a shared death experience with someone else that may even be far away from them at the time that they did not know was dying. Well, you can't attribute that experience to a dying brain if their brain's not dying. And there's several experiences along that line that are experienced by perfectly normal people whose brains seem fine, So all these explanations that are saying this is something that happens to the dying brain, it just wouldn't apply in their case. So my mother, this is something you didn't ask me this question, but it just came to mind. I think I got to say it. Is that one of the really powerful things about these experiences is I like to go into the great studies that give me many, many, many examples so that I'm not dealing with the little anomalous studies that you get from YouTube, right? But, and I made no attempt at doing this, but just I was taking care of my mother. I took care of several relatives over the past 25 years who were dying or needed our help over the years. But I was with my mother years ago, and she said, "Hey, tell your cousin Bucky here what you're studying." I said, "I'm studying near-death experiences." He said, "Oh, I've had one of those." In fact, he said he had 3 of them, but 2 of them were actually other kinds of visions. But this was a very respected relative, history major who's taught all of his life, very well respected in among the relatives. And in the middle of the night, he had um, woken up with a start and came out of his body, saw a tunnel in the corner, felt like something extremely heavy was on his chest, like a heart attack, right? Taught some heavenly beings, came back into his body, woke up in a cold sweat. First time this has ever, anything like this has ever happened. Immediately the phone rang, and it was a nurse from hours away saying that his dad had just died of a sudden heart attack. He didn't even know his dad was ill or was having heart trouble. Okay, now that doesn't mean anything to y'all. Y'all might think I'm just making things up, but to me, this is very powerful. And if what I found is I went to church and sat around with a group of men. We were having a men's breakfast one time. I mentioned something about I studying near-death experiences. The guy on the left said, "Those things are real." I said, "Really?" And he told me about his near-death experience where he saw Jesus. These things are all around us. 4% of the populations of Germany and the United States, when surveyed, said they'd had a near-death experience. I believe it was 6% when they surveyed them in Australia. Deathbed experiences in a hospice unit, in-house hospice unit in New York, they actually surveyed the patients each day to see what they had been experiencing. Over 80% have been experiencing deathbed visions where they would be talking with deceased relatives or talking with angelic creatures, seeing visions before death. These are so common that when you start talking to people about them, you'll find them everywhere. I just didn't know that there was actually evidence attached to these that somebody not experiencing them could look into. So it's just been a huge surprise to me, and that's why I can't get enough research on it.
What you mentioned this common objection, was it Inokia? And would you say INOCIA? And
Anoxia, not enough,
what is
yeah,
that
not
again?
enough oxygen
Not
to
enough
the
oxygen in
brain.
the brain.
Right, right.
What's that about?
Well, when someone dies and stops breathing, of course, at some point you're not getting enough oxygen to the brain, and naturalists would say, well, it's just these are the type things that happen with anoxia. But lots of studies have been done on anoxia, and what happens is people's brains very quickly, you're not able to have coherent thoughts, you're not able to lay down memories. It's just very fuzzy. Whereas when people have near-death experiences, what they report is things that they can remember probably better than anything that they've ever experienced in their life. They can't forget the experience. It's like a video embedded in their brain, and they will say that they were in hyper consciousness, not just they're saying it's realer than the real reality they experience in daily life, which is very different from the effects of lack of oxygen. So it just doesn't seem like any kind of a full explanation of what's going on.
Okay. Final question. Do any of these experiences across the board, since they're so worldwide and so common, could someone say that this just kind of leads to like universalism? I mean, the belief everybody gets into heaven one day, we're all going to be saved. And so could this kind of lead to that teaching, you think, or kind of contribute to that? Or how do you see that?
Many people certainly say that. And people that go on to YouTube and just kind of listen to experience after experience after experience, what they're getting is what the YouTube algorithm feeds them, which are probably mostly anomalous experiences and ones that people like because they were saying what they wanted them to say, right?
Hmm.
But if you really look at the core experience that the researchers have found, there again, when I looked at those 140 plus experiences, consecutive experiences that had been submitted to a database, I just didn't find any of the experiences saying on the other side, everybody's okay. Everybody's going to heaven no matter what you believe. Everybody's fine. In fact, you see a lot that are experiencing some very bad things on the other side, and they're seeing other people who apparently have been on the other side who are experiencing very distressing times. So I think some people again that will have the experience and immediately afterward will say, "Oh, everybody's fine. Don't worry about death. Everybody's fine." They're not getting that from the experience. That's just kind of their first interpretation because of their one little experience. I believe that when they search further and look at more experiences and seek God more, they'll find out, well, it's more complicated than that. But again, it's very rare that anyone is told on the other side that everybody's okay. In fact, people say, "Oh, well, God doesn't judge you on the other side." Well, of course He does. He's in the sense, depending on what you mean by judge, He's letting people know what they did that was loving, which was not loving, the things in their life that hurt people. Well, if you obviously see where your life has fallen short, why additionally does a loving God need to yell at you for it? I think that's enough judgment. So people that are saying nobody's judged, well, some do feel judged by God, but even the ones that just are judging themselves, it is sort of a judgment, right? That there's a right way to live, there's a wrong way to live.
Okay, that's interesting. Let me go ahead and take some questions here. We've got one in the chat box already. Carl is asking, why do some distressing experiences involve demons and mockery and torture, but others involve a type of void or outer darkness and utter abandonment? I can't remember your chapter on hellish encounters when you talk about this.
I actually have 3 chapters on that. I,
Yeah.
I think like a lot of researchers, they just those type experiences give us the creeps and we just rather not study them.
Right.
Who wants to look into stuff like that? But I'm glad that some researchers did. I'll mention a few of them for those that want to do more research. Let's see. You still there?
I'm here. We're here.
Good. I was afraid I just pulled out my plug. But a few years after Moody, Moody himself mentioned that some experiences were distressing. Um,
That's not D.L. Moody, right?
Not D.L. Moody. That's a different Moody
From a different time.
from a different time. But I did find many great Christians in the past who've experienced deathbed experiences upon their deathbed. So a lot of high-ranking Christians that you respect through history have experienced these things. And in fact, as far as visions are concerned, in Strobel's book on miracles, Lee Strobel talks about a vision in his life that really impacted him later when he became a Christian.
Hmm.
And so I have a whole chapter just kind of spreading it out to other types of visions. And the person Allison that teaches at Princeton,
Dale
he,
Allison.
he
Dale Allison.
Dale Allison,
The
his
New
book
Testament.
Encountering Mystery.
Right.
He says the reason I ended up going into philosophy and theology and teaching at a seminary is because of a visionary experience that I had
Mhm.
earlier in life. So I,
Mhm.
I think naturalism just made cowards of all of us. None of us wanted to talk about things like this, even within the Christian world, even though visions are all over the Bible. Back to your question, Carla, weren't you with us
Yeah,
when
she
we
was there
talked
last.
last? I thought I remembered you. Yeah, welcome back. Uh, this book, Maurice
Pull
Rawlings,
that up there
he
high. Pull that up
he
high.
too is a
Oh, I had that book. I remember.
cardiologist.
Yeah.
Now, he didn't do a great study like Sabom and others did, not a real careful study, but he reported on his patients and other patients that he saw. He felt like these distressing experiences might be up to 50% of the experiences if we caught people right when they were being resuscitated. He said some of them were so harrowing that people would just kind of put it out of their minds, and you would talk to them later and they'd say, "What experience?" But he thinks that they're much more common than that. Beyond Death's Door was another one of his books. He talked about them. In more recent years, Nancy Evans Bush wrote Dancing Past the Dark. And I really recommend Barbara Romer. She's a physician who studied a lot of these negative experiences. And Romer just believes that people get the experience that they need, that it must just be a God thing, that he says, this person, Christian or non-Christian, some need a heavenly experience to assure them of God's love. Okay. Others need to be shaken up a little bit. Maybe they're a Christian, but they're not really that, that committed to God. They're just nonchalant, by name only. And they need to realize, there's something else out there too. And this person needs this experience. So I'm just going to take it that God knows what person needs what type experience. And you say, well, wait a minute, it's kind of not fair if you're the doubter type and you don't even get to have a near-death experience. Those people seem to have an apologetic advantage. But remember, there are all kinds of things that God uses. There are all kinds of visions. People will see an angelic presence. A huge percentage of the populations of United States and England will say they've seen an angel or had a dramatic answer to prayer. So I think God lets different people have different experiences depending on what's really going to help them get their lives straightened out. Does that help? I hope I'm answering the question correctly.
I don't know. She'll have to respond.
There's a lot to think through, and that's why I wrote a big book this time, because there's really a lot to think through about these things.
Okay, so Larry's asking, this is to me, is there a difference between drugs and intoxia? Did we already talk about this? Is it called intoxia? Intoxia? I don't know what that is. All right. Well,
maybe
I'll
drugs
look
and
up that with him. I don't know
hypoxia
anything
or
about it.
something like that. We did mention the DMT and LSD, how those experiences actually differ greatly from near-death and deathbed experiences. And there's some very good studies and peer-reviewed literature on that as well, that, if people want more information, I could take you to those studies.
Okay. Anybody else have any other questions about this topic or comments about anything? It's all on you now. Take it away. If you don't ask him questions, I'm going to ask him more questions. He doesn't talk to me anymore.
Well, my question dealt with the common objections, and he mentioned about drugs, anoxia, and intoxia. And that's why is the difference between the drugs and intoxia?
I don't remember saying intoxia. I might have said hypoxia, but there's typically, some would say, oh, if you're getting too much oxygen or if you're not getting enough oxygen, they'll talk about that. We know a lot about those experiences because doctors can tell about what happens when you're lacking oxygen. Same thing with drugs. Some people will line up some similarities between LSD or DMT, taking mushrooms or whatever. In fact, those are becoming quite popular among youth today, and I think we need to address them. And they'll say, oh, this is really the same experience. So obviously, our brains just are mimicking that at death. They shoot out some kind of DMT type substance. Actually, a substance like that hasn't been found in the brain. So it's just kind of a hypothesis. Throw out whatever hypothesis you want. We need to examine it. But if you just look, rather than looking at somebody who's trying to make the experience look the same, rather than that, go on the web and look for people's experiences with DMT, their experiences with LSD, not trying to compare them to near-death experiences, but you're going to see these are vastly different experiences, the two. And so yes, there are similarities. People have a feeling that it's really real, when they're on LSD. And a lot of
course.
people who are atheists become believers in God because they say, okay, there is something out there besides the body, and it convinces them of that. But saying that a DMT experience is like a near-death experience, to me, is like saying, I throw things in the kitchen sometimes. Tom Brady throws footballs in a football stadium, and it's really the same thing. Well, there are some things I'm using some of the same muscles, okay? Sometimes I'm accurate, okay? But it's really two very different experiences when you look at the core of experience of each.
Okay. Silas wants to know why God would even give people this chance. What don't they just need it? Faith comes by hearing the gospel. So generally the most normative way people come to Christianity is through a proclamation of the gospel, as we know, as you say in your book. I know you believe that wholeheartedly. So you're not against that at all. But
No.
why would, I know you're not, but why would God even allow something like this? Why does he need to use this when he's got the Bible now? We've got preachers, we've got missionaries, we've got us. We can share with people. That's the main way. And I think you kind of addressed this already, but I think he's looking for maybe a repeat here. Why God would give them this kind of chance when they've
Well,
already got everything
I
available.
think we're assuming certain things when we say God only works this way. Like when people say, well, God just works through the Bible and the Holy Spirit now, so we don't really need these, any of these apologetics. That's the way he works. But the Bible never says that God only works through the word of God. In fact, that very verse, faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of Christ. But the New Testament wasn't even written at that time. I mean, it was the word about Christ that they were proclaiming, right? That was bringing people to God. But if you read through the Gospel of John as to why people were supposed to believe, what was the basis of their belief? And often you'll see that he's working miracles, and then he tells them very specifically in certain places, like after he healed the nobleman's child from a distance, he said that some of you, he said without signs and wonders, they simply will not believe. Now I used to think he was just kind of cutting them down for not believing without any miracles. But I think if you look honestly through the Gospel of John, he's working signs and wonders. And if you look at John chapter 5, he specifically says, don't believe me just because I say it. Look, you believed in John that he was a prophet. Well, he talked about me. Look, if you believe because of the signs and wonders, okay, believe because of the prophecies. In Acts 1, he says that Jesus showed him alive to his disciples and others through many convincing proofs. So when people say we don't need evidence, I'm saying the Bible never says we don't need evidence. It doesn't say it's exclusively because of reading the Bible or hearing the gospel preached. It says sometimes it's a believing spouse that brings a person to God. God uses many things, and I think we need to be careful not to put him in a box. I mean, God obviously used a vision with the Apostle Paul, right? He didn't give him the whole gospel through that, but that motivated him, and he went to the people to find out more about the gospel.
I also think it's important that we define visions in the Bible. With the Greek, you got to kind of translate that. But I mean, sometimes I think of visions like an internal mind, something internal to you, and then is there something, a vision external to you? I mean, like something outside yourself. So did Paul see something obviously that was external to him? And we know whatever Jesus looked like there, we're not exactly sure because it's a post-resurrection encounter. But I think skeptics love to just throw on that. Oh, Paul just had this subjective vision. It's just like an hallucination thing. So you have to kind of clarify what we mean by visions anymore in the Bible, because they're different kinds of visions, obviously. But that's a whole other topic. But
no, but that's important. I mean, when people saw angels, often it was a group of people seeing angels. Well, it looks kind of like those angels were external to themselves. The Holy Spirit came down as a dove
Right.
Apparently people could see that dove. Was that external to themselves, or did God just place it on everybody's retina, or what, what was it? Well, I don't know, but I would say let's not put it. I think one of the big things God does through the Bible is he keeps us from putting him in a box with things. How do miracles work? Jesus just kept doing them different ways. Let's spit on the ground and do some mud this time. This time I'll just say it from afar. This time I'll actually touch the leper. It seems like he's just saying over and over, okay, visions, they're different in different times. Sometimes it's a dream, sometimes it's waking, sometimes so there are just all kinds of ways. And I think we need to resist saying, oh, well, here's this one instance, therefore they're always going to be like this. Well, does the Bible really say that? No, it doesn't say it's always going to be like this. Unless there's some verse I'm not seeing.
Well, the book of Acts is definitely one of the weirder books in the Bible. So anyways, a lot of stuff going on in Acts. So can you address Eden Alexander's book? Carla says technically he was in a coma. Do you know anything about Eden Alexander's book?
I do. That was significant in that he was a well-respected Harvard professor. He was a neurologist. He really didn't believe in all this stuff, of this spiritual stuff going on and soulish stuff outside of the body. And then he had a disease of the brain, encephalitis or something, that he goes into great length saying, okay, as a neurologist, I can tell you when this is going on, the brain is not able to function. And during this time, I had this out-of-body experience where I was talking to beings on the other side. And I think it's a significant book for people who say, well, neurologists know that this can't happen. In fact, a few years earlier than him, another neurologist had written and said, oh, if you really understood neurology, you'd know that that everything can be accounted for in the brain. And then, but he wasn't a Harvard professor. Now a Harvard professor comes along and says, well, I just had one of these experiences, and I can tell you, I was fully conscious somewhere else when my brain shouldn't have been able to function. So I think it's a significant book. And he does have, I did actually went to hear him speak one time, and he clarified on something. He said that somebody on the other side told him, don't worry, you can't do anything wrong. And people had said, hey, wait a minute, the Bible says you can sin. And he said, of course, I was talking about on the other side, that some being was comforting me and say, don't worry about what you do over here, because you're not going to touch the wrong thing and turn into an elephant or something weird, probably. So I don't necessarily believe all the things people like that say. Again, I think sometimes you can mix up a hallucination with your experience, or somebody that's writing a book can embellish on things. Some people can have mental illness. Some people can have false memories. That's why I tend to stick to the best studies of near-death experiences rather than reading these other books, even if it's a neurologist who's reporting his own experience.
Eric, you're muted. Thank you, Dr. Miller.
Carla, why are you texting in your questions? You can talk. Now I don't understand that. Okay. Owen makes a comment, shouldn't put God in a box, which Dr. Miller wholeheartedly agrees. Shauna says, does the Bible and either testament have the idea of levels in heaven? Some Kabbalah teachings believe there are different levels or spheres to heaven, and so do Mormons too, of course. So anyway, I don't know, that may be getting a little off track, but
no, I think that's a good question, a legitimate question. And I think that I think that biblically there are obviously different let's say rewards. When we talk about rewards in heaven, and Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount that you'll be rewarded for certain things. Well, what do these rewards mean? Well, it may be that everybody's experiencing the same thing in heaven. They're all in similar places, but that that some have the capacity to enjoy heaven more than others, because of the life they lived as a Christian, that they were fully living for him. And so I think, and also there seem to be levels of hell as well. And again, level, I don't know if it necessarily means different places or if it's just that some will experiencing something worse than others. For example, when Jesus talks about woe to you, certain places, if these places like Sodom and Gomorrah and others, if they had known the things that here, they would have repented a long time ago. So it's going to be worse for you in the judgment. So one differentiator is people that really knew a lot more than somebody else are going to be judged more if they reject it all than others. So maybe there are levels to hell. Maybe it's just an experiential thing where some would be judged harsher than others. Maybe the same with heaven, that we're all in the same places, but some have the capacity to enjoy it more than others. There is some kind of differentiation, but I don't think the Bible makes it clear what those specific differentiators are. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Any other questions or comments? Going to wrap up here soon. Anybody else? Anyone?
Can I just mention a couple of things?
Someone said something. Go ahead. Who talked?
Oh, I was just going to share that there was a time when a neighbor had accidentally stabbed herself with a knife and there was a lot of blood and she was still alive, but she saw herself above her body and me working on her, but she was still alive.
So there are really all kinds of near-death experiences that are, there's the core experiences within them, but some are deeper than others. So one person may they have an auto accident, they come out of their body, they look at the accident, and they can describe things that are going on while they're clinically dead, and then they come back. They didn't have a life review, they didn't have all this other stuff, they didn't see a great place of beauty. They may have experienced great peace and just saw themselves outside of their body. I would consider that a part of a near-death experience. Some would say you have to have more than that to really be considered a full near-death experience, but it's just however we're classifying it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I would just wanted to share that because it like maybe she was losing enough blood, but God preserved her and people were praying, but she did. It was just interesting because she did see us from the ceiling.
Yes. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And that's, of course, I'm teaching in a public university. I have a little book called Faith That's Not Blind, and I use it when they're coming to the end of the section on philosophy of religion, Faith That's Not Blind. And what I have is like 17 lines of argument for the existence of God. And I have them rate each of these arguments on a scale of 0 to 10 as to how compelling they are. And a lot of the students, really, some of the most compelling are near-death experiences, deathbed experiences, and miracles, that whole cluster there. But some of them will tell why they put those as the number one arguments over the beginning of the universe or the settings of the universe or objective morality, these type things that we argue. But often they will say, I believe in this, not because of your argument, because I've experienced it myself, or we've experienced it in my family or among my friends. And I think one thing I want to emphasize is that even when you get beyond near-death and deathbed experiences, these are so common that I think we need to use these in talking to people that may not be that interested in Christianity at first, but they've had an experience that conflicts with naturalism and suggests there's more to this life. But let me just mention a few of these. When I got to the end of this book, Is Christianity Compatible? In the conclusion, I started mentioning some very good surveys that have been done. I mentioned the 4% people experiencing near-death experiences. 10 to 15% say they've seen someone who wasn't physically present, such as seeing someone who had just died that was a friend that they didn't know had died, and they experienced that person. It's called a crisis apparition. 20% or more of North Americans report an experience with evil spiritual entities, like such as demons. This is 20%. Okay, this is like one out of a group. You're talking about a lot of people here. 23% of Americans report hearing a voice or seeing a vision in response to prayer. That's over 76 million Americans. Over 30% report vividly experiencing a deceased loved one. 36% of Americans acknowledge having had a religious experience particularly powerful. 43% of American adults report unusual or inexplicable spiritual experiences, from out-of-body travel to dreams or visions. 54% report being protected from harm by a guardian angel. 82% report being very conscious of the presence of God at least once in their lives. Over 80% of the dying in that facility having deathbed experiences. Now, I kind of wonder, if you add all those up, you're way over 100%, because some of them obviously experienced more than one of them. But I'd like to survey people who are elderly and say, during your life, have you had any of these types of experiences? It may be that almost all of us have some type of visionary experience before we die. And Allison from Princeton says, if we're claiming to be pastors and Christian leaders and we have nothing significant to say about people's most important spiritual experiences, we're just not very relevant, are we? Let's start talking to people about the experiences and helping them to interpret it and think through it as regards our spirituality. In fact, there's a movie coming out end of this month, Angel Productions, forgot the name of it. I haven't previewed it, but it's going to be kind of like a documentary on near-death experiences. It's going to be in movie theaters. The person who just last week got a Nobel Prize for literature, he had a near-death experience that was very influential on his life when he was in high school. Let's start talking about this. I think there's a lot of powerful apologetic material there that we can have something in common with as we talk to people about them and help them interpret them.
Stephen, can you hold up that book again? Faith is Not Blind. Someone wanted to see that. Your book, Faith is Not Blind.
Sure. All these are available on
right. Faith is
and I go as J. Steve Miller to separate myself from the band and all these things.
You did sing Fly Like an Eagle. Yes.
Okay, I'll admit it. That was a part of my past life. But Faith is Not Blind. And if you ever want, anybody wants to use these in a class to do a similar survey, I'll just send you a free PDF. In fact, if you want to read any of these, don't have the money, I'll give you a free PDF. I'm not making tons of money off these. I think it's a fascinating experience that has great potential for the gospel that I want people to be aware of.
Well, we know in the publishing world, there's not a lot of money that's made in publishing, unless you're selling a whole lot of books. Anyway,
can I share just a couple more things?
Please.
Well, I do use the near-death experiences quite a lot on campus to disprove naturalism. And the experiences of people seeing accidents 3 blocks away from the hospital room, or just things that just really can't be explained by hallucination or whatever. But I had another book, I'm trying to remember if it was called Touching Heaven, but it seemed like in every chapter of this chaplain in a children's hospital that the children saw so many, whether they were angels or Jesus or whatever, that it was so frequent among terminally ill children, and it was actually a very encouraging book.
Let me recommend, this may be the one you're talking about, Diane Comp, A Window to Heaven. It's just a little book. You can get it cheap used on the internet, but she was a pediatric oncologist teaching at Yale University School of Medicine. And Diane Comp, K-O-M-P, she considered herself an atheist or existentialist, kind of vacillating between all that. And when she began her practice and she began seeing children die and how they died, many of them had experiences with heaven on the other side that were convincing to her, that brought her over to theism and Christianity. And it's just a good little book to give people because it doesn't cost much. It's very thin, easy to read. I'd recommend that as well. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Awesome.
Larry, just email me. I can get that to you, the PDF for that. Okay. Okay. Well, I think that's about it. Maybe one more question. We're going to wrap it up here, pray out. Oh, one last thing. So, Dr. Miller, you think that this work you're doing is hopefully going to do more research, more work. It's going to build more in it's going to certainly increase with more material in apologetic literature. Hopefully this will be like a mainstream apologetic argument, right? Kind of like we use the design arguments, the resurrection arguments, all the other stuff, right? Kind of goes
Yeah,
along.
I went to 3 schools undergrad, 3 schools, grad schools. I was never familiarized with this stuff. Some were Christian schools, some were secular. Why didn't I ever even hear about this? Especially, I never had a chapter in apologetics book on it when I was a doubter, a questioner. I needed things like this. To me, it's been very helpful for my personal faith, taking it to a new level. It's helping me to stay right in there with Jesus. And I think it happens with a lot of others as well. So what I'm trying to do is I try to write in kind of a personable way, but I am dealing with evidence. So some people will say, oh, I just want to hear the stories, just the stories. But I'm telling all about the researchers, how they did the research, and I'm documenting it very carefully because I want this to kind of provide a basis for what we're calling afterlife apologetics to help build this and help others begin to research as well and be familiar with it.
Yeah, I haven't seen anybody really apologists write about it other than a book I had with J.P. Moreland and Gary Habermas. That one book they had a chapter on it or something, but I haven't really seen anybody really do too much work on it. So
Now, Imagine Heaven has been a New York Times bestseller by John Burke.
I have that book.
He's like a technology guy who became a Christian and is a pastor, and
Right.
he's written on it as well, more on a popular level.
Right.
But his is helpful as well.
Right. Right. Yes, I do. I have read that book. And like I said, that was the book where I kept seeing the common themes in each near-death experience, the very same themes that seem like all across the board. So that's why I was asking you about that. But anyways, well, I encourage everybody to get Dr. Miller's materials, and hopefully you can use this in some of your conversations. And I think that it's a powerful apologetic that hopefully can build and build over the years to come. We'll see what God wants to do with it. But there's plenty of people that have near-death experiences, and I haven't had one, but I know some people that have, that's for sure. So anyway, but we appreciate you coming on, Dr. Miller, and God bless you and all you're doing. I know you said that your students down there where you teach are certainly interested in this topic. So you're getting a lot of, interest in it among them. So that's a good thing. And you're
yes. I think that we just ask God to use us whatever our field is, and that's what I'm trying to do.